Anyways, but Jeremy's right. Today was a very challenging day for Israel. We were at a meeting of activists in Jerusalem trying to understand what is the calling of the generation. And that's when the news of the attack came in, but they weren't clear. As always at the beginning, they're not clear. And then just a few hours ago, we had a mechina, a seminary out to the farm. These were like American kids that are right after their high school year, and it was electric, and they were so into it, and they were laughing. And then right at the end, one of the group leaders made the announcement that from what I understood, this man, Eliyahu, that was killed, Eliyahu K, that was murdered, he ran towards the attack to get involved. He heard the attack happening, to get involved and save lives. And he was killed trying to save the lives of his fellow Jews. And he was the cousin, that's when the leader made the announcement, that he was the cousin of one of the kids that were right there with us in this group, from what I understood. And everyone was shell-shocked and devastated, in tears. And it was just really, really difficult. And this grief that we're in, I think it really amplifies the message that I want to share with you guys today. Because not only today, where we find ourselves in Jewish history and in world history, and that's this confrontation that happened between Jacob and the angel, followed by his confrontation when he was already Yisrael, right afterwards with Esau. And this was a confrontation of forces that was so powerful that the consequences of it continue resonating throughout history until today. So I'm sure you know, in most places, Jacob and Esau are painted as the forces of light and darkness, right? Between good and evil. And the sages say, Esav sonet Yaakov, halacha Moshe Sinai. This means Esau hates Jacob, a law from Moses at Sinai. Very often Jews are involved in debating the root of Jew hatred, and like we were today, really. And we find ourselves at this familiar juncture of realizing that there's really no rules to Jew hatred. We're rich or we're poor or communist or capitalist, no matter what faith or ideology, we seem to be hated no matter what. And then someone chimes in with the famous quote, Esav sonet Yaakov, Esau hates Jacob, and that's just how it is. That's just the way things are. And in other places that the sages say, and tell me if I'm wrong here, Jeremy, you can tell me, if someone tells you that Rome, right, which is Esau, is rising, and Jerusalem, which is Jacob, is also rising, don't believe them. If they say that Rome is falling and Jerusalem is falling, don't believe them either. But if they say Rome is rising and Jerusalem is falling, believe them. And if they say Jerusalem is rising and Rome is falling, believe them. Meaning Rome and Jerusalem are inverse spiritual powers, and one's rise is always at the expense of the other. So the point of all this is that this confrontation between Jacob and the angel, who our sages widely agree is the guardian angel of Esau, as well as the confrontation between Jacob and Esau, it has such profound consequences. And we've learned together in the past, Ma'aseh avot siman labanim. The acts of the fathers are a sign for the children. Jeremy, can I have 3 more minutes here, just a little bit longer? Okay, there's so many facets of this encounter which we can look in more deeply, but there are just a couple points I want to focus on in our limited time. So Jacob is approaching his brother Esau, and who's just been brooding. He's been reveling in this hatred, and he's been so thirsty for his revenge against Jacob for 20 years. 20 years. This could be the end of the story right here as far as Jacob's concerned. After all, Esau is a legendary warrior and a leader, and Jacob, well, he studies in tents, right? Hashem promised Jacob, it's true, that he would make him a great nation, but our sages say that Jacob thought that perhaps he had sinned, or he lost his merits, and he lost the binding nature of that promise, or perhaps he felt that he was diminished by the kindnesses that Hashem had done with him. The kindness that he received were just more than he deserved, and he used up his merits, as we see in chapter 8, verse 11, when he says, Katonti mikol hachasadim mikol ha'emet shasita im avdecha. I have been diminished, right, or made smaller by all the kindnesses and the truth that you have done with your servant. I don't know if that was just put up on the screen, but you know, I have to admit that this sentiment that they say Jacob had here really resonated with me. That's the quote there. You can look at it. For I often look at my life, right? I'm living in this Garden of Eden on the Judean frontier. I'm gifted with being able to really fulfill my greatest joy of sharing and teaching about Israel and Hashem with the world, and I look at my wife Shana, and I look at our daughter Dvash, and I look at the family we're building, and I feel so thoroughly unworthy. I feel like there's many years where I suffered, where yes, perhaps I earned some credits during that suffering, like when I passed up on the rational and lucrative job opportunities to pursue this mission that we're in, but I feel like I just used up those credits by now for sure. But I definitely feel like I have more than I deserve, and when I'm stuck at looking at the world in such a a simple way like that through that prism, it makes me nervous. I feel uneasy about it, and it can feel nerve-wracking. And I understand how Jacob at that point could feel diminished and unworthy, and he was scared, and that fear in and of itself made him even more afraid. Right in chapter 32 verse 8, it says, "Vayira vayitzar meod vayitzar lo." Jacob became frightened, and it distressed him. And this spoke to me very powerfully as well, because I don't think there's a place in the whole Torah where I identify with Jacob more than exactly right here in this portion, because Jacob was frightened, and therefore he was distressed, because as we know, fear is a form of idolatry. Fear is the belief that something may happen which shouldn't happen. And whenever I feel fear, which I often do, I often find myself more disturbed by what I judge to be the spiritual failure and shortcoming of faith that fear represents than I am of the very thing the fear is attached to. I'm more disturbed by the fear itself than the thing I'm afraid of, if that makes any sense. And so my personal understanding is that Jacob was distressed by the fear itself. He felt that he'd run out of merits and that Hashem may not be with him anymore. As a matter of fact, our sages teaches us that Jacob was indeed hoping with all of his heart that the night before this encounter with Esau, or any point leading up to it, he would have had this divine revelation which would grant him clarity. But he received nothing. He got no prophecy, no clarity, nothing. And for that reason, we're told is that why didn't Hashem give him this clarity? Because Hashem is mitaveh the tefillot tzadikim. Hashem yearns for, he's thirsty for the prayers of the righteous. And so he wanted Yaakov to be afraid so he could dig as deep as he could and pour out his heart in prayer. And so Hashem denied him the clarity and the prophecy that he really wanted. Anyways, all right, I'm going to try to bring this together. So he wasn't granted a revelation, and so he starts making preparations. And we read in the text, he takes a three-pronged approach. He prepared for war, he prayed, and he sent lavish tribute, meaning that he also took this route of appeasement. And every step of this has consequences into the future. For example, there was serious prophetic foreshadowing to the division of the camp, in which Jacob split up his family and his possessions so they shouldn't be destroyed in the situation where Esau would attack him and there was a battle. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, points out that this was actually the situation we saw being played out throughout the entire exile. That just as Jacob divided the camp, the nation of Israel would be divided up amongst the nations for that very reason. Because at any given point, one nation would inflict horrible, catastrophic death on the exiles of Israel. For example, the Crusades and the pogroms and the Holocaust throughout Europe. While during those very times of wholesale massacre elsewhere in the world, the rest of the Jews would find themselves among other host nations that at that moment were much more benevolent and treated them more humanely. So just as Jacob divided up the nation to prevent complete destruction, the children of Israel were scattered among many other nations throughout the exile to ensure their survival as well. But here's what I want to say. The part that I found really challenging and thought-provoking was how Jacob could possibly take all these different approaches without being dishonest or disingenuous. Because it seemed like these approaches are really mutually exclusive. It seemed like he couldn't sincerely and honestly send tribute and blessings and expressions of love and brotherhood, while at the same time prepare for a war, prepare to kill, right? He either hated Esau or he loved him. How could he possibly pray? And how could he possibly pray and put his faith in God's hands while at the same time pragmatically and practically preparing for every scenario as if God weren't in the picture at all? And the reason this seeming contradiction is so challenging is because, as we know from the concepts that Jeremy's been teaching, that he's writing actually a book about, that each one of these forefathers represented and manifested a certain attribute. But the attribution of these attributes to our forefathers isn't taught by Jeremy alone, but by the sages of Israel and the prophets of Israel. For example, the prophet Micah. I don't know, Jeremy, if you knew this, but the prophet Micah, he speaks about the attributes of both Jacob and Abraham in chapter 7, verse 20 of the book of Micah, right? It says, "You shall give the truth of Jacob, the loving kindness of Abraham, which you swore to our forefathers from the days of old." Jacob is the attribute of truth, right? Not of pragmatism and not of practicality. And so how could he embody truth, but at the same time seemingly embody these conflicting and opposite characteristics? So I remember that one of the wars that Jeremy and I were in, we found ourselves in Gaza, and we were abruptly called up to the army, right? Because that's how it is. One day, one moment, we're just living our lives, lost in whatever we're doing, then boom. Sometimes within a few hours, we find ourselves putting on a uniform and being sent out to war. And this war, we were called up during a very challenging time of my life. I was going through a pretty painful divorce. And I remember that however dark and painful it was, Hashem was really blessing me with light and with clarity that I've been able to take with me and incorporate into my life from that period of time. And these lessons that I took into my life, I remember with crystal clarity. I was able to internalize them into my essence during the throes of that painful, dark time that I was in. And what was this realization? Well, I've shared it with you before, but I feel like I can't say it enough times. It was just so life-changing. It was that anger and hatred are just toxic. They're toxic to the person who allows those emotions to dwell within them. And that it's always possible to replace those negative emotions with love and compassion. But when we were called up to war, it wasn't a divorce I was dealing with, it was Hamas. What was I supposed to feel compassion and love for Hamas? How was I not supposed to feel hatred for them and have this toxic feeling within me? I was trying to reconcile that. Hamas, right, whose very essence is dedicated to finishing what Hitler started and murdering every single last Jew. Hamas, who murdered this holy Jew today in the old city. How can I possibly feel compassion for them? And that's when it hit me. I thought about World War II as the other most extreme example possible. And I pictured that just as I'm a sharpshooter in the Israeli army, that I was a sharpshooter and I saw a Nazi carrying a canister of Zyklon B to a gas chamber filled with innocent Jews. So knowing what we know about this world, that it's a fleeting dream and that we're not bodies with souls, but we are souls that are briefly wearing a garment called this body. Knowing that, what's the greatest kindness I could do for the Nazi himself? The answer would be to shoot him dead before he had the opportunity to perform such a heinous act as murdering all those Jews, an act that would cause his soul to suffer and be in torment for all of eternity. So while on one dimension, yes, I hated that Nazi, but on the deepest dimension, I know it sounds weird, I loved him as a child of Hashem. And the greatest way to manifest that love for him would be to kill him. As crazy as that sounds. So these Hamas terrorists, they weren't just trying to kill me and Jeremy. That I could forgive them for. They were trying to infiltrate into this Jewish village that we were protecting to murder every single innocent woman and child. And it was during that war that my range of emotions, my range of attributes was able to expand and hold two seemingly contradictory emotions in my heart at the same time, at the same moment. And that, my friends, is what I believe Jacob had to contain at that point. It didn't compromise his truth at all. For keep in mind that Jacob fought the angel, he became Israel, right? The national consciousness, the confrontational power, the birth of the nation into the world, but he didn't lose his identity of Jacob. He was still called Jacob too. And so when he sent these lavish gifts and bowed down to Esau, that was a true part of him. He truly felt Esau's pain and was grieved that he caused him so much anguish. He was sincerely and authentically sorry, but at the same time, he knew the justice of his cause and the righteousness of his position, and he was willing to fight to the death to defend his family if need be. And I think the reason I wanted really to share this with all of you is because we find ourselves right now in a war, right? There are forces of true evil in the world that are gaining strength. I think we all see it and we all feel it. And so we need to be willing to fight these forces of evil with all the strength we have, but for our own sake, for Hashem's sake. We can't let that hatred penetrate into the depths of our souls. We need to be able to fight without losing our love and compassion for the very people that we're forced to fight against. And so I just want to end with this last thing. My wife Shana shared with me a teaching that a rabbi told her. He said that sometimes, like Yaakov's battle with the angel, we must grab hold of our darker moments and insist, I will not let you go until you bless me. So I bless us all, my friends, that we should be able to take the darkness that this world is throwing at us right now and bring light and love and blessing.
As the masks are coming off and much of the world is turning not only against Israel, but yes, against the Jewish people, if you feel different, if your love for Israel is growing deeper and stronger, if you're thirsting to cleave to the nation of Israel and to the God of Israel, if you're thirsting to learn authentic Torah from Jews in Judea, then the Land of Israel Fellowship is for you. Hundreds of individuals and families from around the world come together on Zoom every week in what can only be described as a fellowship of love, friendship, of learning and praying and belonging. A fellowship really unlike any other. It's more than just a movement, it's a family. To learn more about the Land of Israel Fellowship, click on www.thelandofisrael.com/fellowship or send an email to fellowship@thelandofisrael.com. Love and blessings from Judea.